Welcome everyone. We have a lot of nature on stage here, so it's exciting. So there's been a lot of buzz the past couple of years about nature-based solutions. What does that mean for the big conservation groups in terms of deal flow? Are you getting overwhelmed by requests for partnerships? So what does it look like? So let's start with you, Agustin.
Sure, and yeah, nature-based solutions, I think it's usually described in the context of climate, right? If you think of climate change and everything we've been talking about for these last couple of days, in terms of the solutions package, if you trace it back to the emissions, nature, natural systems, right now are responsible for about a third of total emissions. So that's deforestation, that's agriculture, that's a number of things that you would associate with it. And since it's a third, it's sort of a third of the problem, it's also a third of the solution, right? But it goes way beyond that. So nature-based solutions are how we get our fresh water, how we deal with fresh air, all kinds of ways that nature help us live the way that we've lived for thousands of years, right? We've taken it for granted, but now that's becoming more quantifiable, more mature, and there's certainly a ton of interest behind that.
So David, are you getting approached by people interested in nature-based solutions looking for opportunities in the space?
Yeah, we get approached a lot, but we're always looking for more partners. I mean, the problem is that people are looking for quality projects. So we have both a supply issue as well as the need for more investors, more partners that engage in these projects that can help make them successful, and particularly partners that are interested in quality as well, because we need to raise the bar on that in order to continue to get support for these big deals going forward.
And so Mike, you're kind of different from the other folks here, which is, you're more at a research policy institution. So what does this sort of surge in interest around nature-based solutions mean for you?
Yeah, it's kind of a boom time for this, and like all booms, it's kind of messy, and it gets to the supply and demand. We want quality at both ends. And I think in some ways, things are moving so fast that it's not being, from a science point of view, we feel it's not at that level of quality it needs to be. And that gives us our opportunity, really. It's really it's spurred us to create an entire new initiative at our center to really try to inject science into both the supply and demand side so we can quantify or bring that level of integrity up on both the programs, the projects available, products available, and what the buyer sees and can trust.
And so, Augustine, you mentioned carbon as being the main focus, but is that changing? Like, is that evolving? Is there interest in biodiversity and other aspects of nature-based solutions yet, or is it still really mostly about carbon?
I think, so carbon is sort of the tip of the iceberg, right? The more we learn about nature, the more we learn how much we depend on it. Carbon is the most sort of obvious and quantifiable, and it's a CO2 atom, right? So it's very concrete. Biodiversity is right behind it, and we just keep unlocking more and more of these kind of services that we need. So I think that will continue. But to some degree, this kind of interest is kind of the world waking up to what a lot of us in this room have been saying for a long time, right? Telling corporates, telling governments, people need nature, society needs nature, and now they finally sort of woken up to the fact and said, okay, we get it. So what do we do, right? Where do we deploy our capital? What should I do? What should I invest in? And I think that's what we're struggling with to some degree as a sector is people, people get it. And it's then turning the sort of interest into investable opportunities. But yeah, carbon is by far right now the biggest. And it's still small. So it's about a $2 billion market if we're talking about the voluntary carbon markets. We think that's going to grow to around 30 billion or so by 2030. It's still modest. I mean, that's the frozen pizza market in the U.S., right? So it's not, it's not nowhere near some of these much bigger markets. But it's way, it's incredibly significant because conservation has been chronically underfunded for a long time.
And so, would that be the same for you? You're seeing mostly carbon, but some other areas are getting built out as well?
Yeah, carbon is really growing, but we're seeing it in other areas. I think there's probably two different areas we're working. One is in the regenerative agriculture space, and a great example of this is the work we're doing in India, where about a third of the air pollution in Delhi, one of the most polluted, if not the most polluted cities on Earth, comes from crop residue burning for rice and wheat in Punjab, which doesn't need to happen. You can do no-till farming there and improve soil health, improve productivity, reduce costs, and reduce the leading cause of death in Delhi, all in the same way. And we're getting investors that are really interested in this type of regenerative agriculture as a way to help people and produce profits.
So Mike, you work in the Amazon primarily, and fire is obviously a big issue there, as is carbon, but then there's also the whole water element. And so, what is your institution kind of looking at in there in terms of opportunities and around nature-based solutions in the Amazon?
So it gets to the other ecosystem services. One, we're hearing people talk quite a bit about biodiversity, trying to quantify it. The second one, the big one, is climate regulation. The direct climate regulation of forests, the evaporation, temperature, and rainfall. They have massive impacts locally and regionally and globally. So that's where we're putting a lot of effort into that, because that gets to the fire question. You cut down forest, you raise the temperature by 5 degrees C immediately. That leads to degradation of the existing forest, and fire is really the means by which that happens. So we're finding that, and the amount of degradation is the same as the deforestation. Essentially, if you deforest, you double it by degradation. You're losing that much carbon, biodiversity, and climate regulation. So a great deal of our effort really is quantifying that and putting it in terms that can be included in these metrics. So that carbon doesn't need to be your only metric. You need to have a suite of metrics, and then you can choose from those, some combination of those that makes most sense to you as, say, an investor or as a conservationist.
And if I could add to that, I think part of why the research is so important in general, and this is not new, right? This is the evolution of decades of research, is that we're making the invisible visible, right? So we've depended on nature for so much, but it's all sort of anecdotal and hard to quantify. And now we're at a point where we can quantify it, and you can actually, whether you choose to place a value on it or not, that's sort of a different question. But we understand exactly, how dependent we are, and then that means regulators, companies, even private landowners can make decisions based upon that value.
And so, how does this actually translate to deals in the real world? So, what is like a nature-based deal for for you? Let's start with David.
Well, we've talked a lot about carbon, and so Augustine and I, just yesterday, we've been working together on this big project in Belize to conserve about 160,000 hectares in northern Belize. And this is land that would have been converted to corn and soybeans. There are farmers adjacent there that have converted multiple large forest tracts, corn, soybean, and then in dairy. And so we used philanthropy for about half the acquisition cost of that, and then we're selling carbon credits, avoided deforestation, REDD+, in order to cover the other half of the acquisition costs there. And there have been problems with the carbon markets in the past. It's been well reported, but I was there last week, and you fly over, and there's a hard edge on this forest. And that edge would have moved into another 160,000 hectares of forest that would have gone to corn and soybeans with all the related costs to our planet. And so that's a real power of using these markets to make a difference for nature and for people. And we've worked together on that, and that's another good thing.
We need more of that in the conservation space. So, Augustine, what does a deal look like for you? Like structure-wise and...
Yeah, I think they're obviously varied, and that's sort of our day job, right? Is trying to figure out how to finance a lot of this work, this conservation work, which is typically dependent on philanthropy, on public dollars, and anything else. And then we kind of scramble around and try and figure out how to put together the capital stack. And there's not enough of it. There's not enough philanthropy. There's not enough public money, even with the IRA and all that. Really, globally. Fiscally speaking, economies are strapped, right? They're very stretched. So what this enables the nature-based sort of economy, and carbon being the main engine of it right now, but it enables things to happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. So the project in Belize is a prime example. But there's other things happening that we have nothing to do with. There's entrepreneurs kind of creating new companies to restore lands in the Amazon, right? The sole business model is to take degraded pasture lands and restore it back to native sort of Amazonian ecosystems, just on carbon, right? That would have been impossible to do 15 years ago, right? Because the business model didn't exist. And if you think about it, from yourself, if you inherited a piece of property from your grandfather or something, you can be land rich but cash poor, right? And that's what many of these communities are facing in the global South. And I think that's what makes me so excited about this. It's a new avenue, right? It's a third way. You don't have to choose just poverty or cut down the forest to put your kids in school. This is sort of a third way. And yeah, it's messy, it's early days, but I think it has huge potential.
Yeah, so you mentioned finance. Is that the main obstacle for making progress on in this space, or are there other things that are really holding back from getting to scale? Maybe, Mike, since you hinted at this earlier.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, in some senses, the finance is kind of getting ahead of the projects, but our problem is trying to design products that would actually scale and work. And so yeah, finance is a huge problem. What I see interest in Brazil in particular, is reforestation projects on private properties. And it might be they buy the property and reforest, or they are trying to contract with people. And that's great, but what we really need to see is projects that are viable to scale that protect existing forest. Because that's the best bang for your buck. And so that's what we've been spending a lot of time on, and through philanthropic means, we've been able to test, we pay large farmers not to deforest land they could legally deforest. So we basically just rent their land. And that's potentially scalable. If you can, get large scale financing, you could just pay people not to deforest. And what we find is they love that. It turns out they love it. So zero risk, money comes in the door. Small farmers is a little trickier, but it's the same sort of thing. How can you get technical support to them to increase their well-being to the point where they don't, and not deforest, and also reforest. These little farms, you can get a couple hectares of reforestation, you get a couple hectares of set-asides. There's 600,000 farms in Pará. That makes a difference. So those are the kinds of things that we're really trying to work on, is can we get this to conservation of protecting existing forests.
I think that's what sometimes people don't fully understand, is that like deforestation is always pictured as the bad guys going in there and cutting down the forest. It's actually a lot of work to deforest, right? So if you're doing it for a reason, and you're putting a lot of money and effort into it. And you don't have to do it, right, if there's an alternative. Most farmers will pick the other alternative if they receive income commensurate with what they would have achieved otherwise. So yeah, I think that's sort of new business models and figuring out how do we conserve what we have. You're absolutely right. You're never going to regrow an old growth forest, right? We're not going to be here 2,000 years from now. So I think figuring that out, how do we conserve what we have while we figure out the messiness, that's sort of where we're in.
And are there certain, I guess, preconditions or enabling conditions you look for sort of in a geography or around a certain ecosystem or jurisdiction, which make a project potentially more attractive versus like what are like some red flags, for you as you can look in this space? Maybe David.
Yeah, for the Nature Conservancy, we're guided by mission first and values, and so we have a very rigorous process to identify lands and waters that are important for biodiversity and carbon, and we do a lot of mapping and analysis to figure that out. And so that's the first cut is this land or water important? Does it contribute to our mission? Does it help us address the biodiversity or climate crisis? And then there's other things like a willing partner to engage with us. We're working very closely with indigenous and local communities and engage them up front, and we use a free, prior, and informed consent process to engage local communities. And that becomes really important in terms of not just making sure we're doing things that they're supportive of, but that they want. And then there's other things, just the ability to finance it. And we'll do a little bit of feasibility study ahead of time to see if that can work. And then government engagement.
Yeah.
Do you have other things to
No,
add?
that's right. And I think it's multi-layered sort of approach. Some of it will be relevant to any project, right? Do you have a trusted counterpart? Is it a legal system? Is there, anything that where you're trying to build a windmill or conserve a forest? A lot of the sort of legal and other aspects will be similar. But when you're focusing on, you have scarce dollars, where do you deploy them? You have to prioritize, right? And for us, we have our own framework of how to prioritize, but it's that overlay between biodiversity and people and that intersection. And increasingly now is this concept of irrecoverable carbon, right? So there's some places in the world that have carbon that has been stored over thousands of years. Think of peat, lands in Indonesia or Canada or wherever. That takes thousands and millions of years to collect. So there's no way to restore that ecosystem in any human relevant sort of time frame, right? So if you're thinking what needs to be conserved first, it's that stuff, right? Let's make sure we don't lose that, because you can't put it back. So that's sort of some of the framing that we use to prioritize.
And I would just add, we use the same, plus when you're working with landowners in Brazil, it's also, are they behaving legally and ethically? You have to do the background check to make sure that they haven't broken laws along the way. And that is really important, because you have to weed out quite a few farms that way.
So how does it work? I mean, so if there's a landowner in Brazil, and do they approach you or do you approach them?
Initially, we approach them. It's the same. You're going out there and you're looking for partners, especially when you think about the large farmers and we're trying to rent their land. Very suspicious of the entire idea. But we did surveys with them. We talked to them. After a while, we gained trust, and a few joined, and it was wonderful. And now they come to us. Now, basically, we have far more people wanting to be part of the program than we have the money to do, and that's great. It shows there's a sense of permanence, right? If we could get this to scale, I think you've got additionality for sure, because they're not going to deforest it, which they would have legally, and you've got permanence in the sense that they love money coming in without.
Yeah, and so what about from the other side? If I'm, say, like a wealthy individual and I want to get involved in this space, I mean, how do I go about doing that?
You contact.
You can give me a call.
Yeah. Just give us a go.
It depends on your motivation, right? If you see it as a way of just having more impact, there's lots of good organizations out there that you can support. If you see it as an investment opportunity, it's obviously a nascent market, but there's opportunities to invest. Or if you want to help others sort of get involved, and there's certainly a lot of our work is working with local communities, indigenous communities, and helping them access markets. They're not our projects, they're their projects, but there's that need for fair intermediation, essentially. So yeah, it sort of depends on your motivation, but it's to some degree, it's buyer beware. So due diligence, figure out, there's a lot of new actors in the space, which is great. But there's some organizations that have been in it for a long time. So TNC, CI, Woodwell, this is what we do, right? This is our mission. And do your due diligence, I guess.
Yeah, so you mentioned beneficiaries, and sort of in the Redd Plus space, which is around forest carbon. Over the years, there's been quite a bit of controversy in terms of these deals getting done, but then the local people who are doing the work then not receiving the benefits. And so I guess, what's the current state of that, and what kind of safeguards do you look for to ensure that the benefits are actually reaching the people on the ground?
Yeah, that is the number one problem. Especially, so for example, in the state of Pará, we're working with small farms. These are, these people need a lot of help. They've been put out in a situation where they're just trying to make a living. Just keep their family fed. It's a very tough environment. So anything we do, it's got to be for their benefit. That's the number one thing. Any intervention I want to try, it has to be for their benefit. And we found, working with corporations, that sometimes that's not a great mesh, because trying to make a profit off that small farm's carbon isn't necessarily going to be working in their best interest. We still haven't done a deal with any corporation on that, because we just can't find a way that's going to work for us. So this has to be restructured, or the expectations have to be adjusted by corporate investors, I think, for these kinds of groups. Because you just can't get involved in a project where you're demanding a 30-year contract from some small family farm to produce X amount of carbon every year. That's just not.
Yeah. And I think I mean, there are a number of companies that are developing carbon projects, and the percentage of the revenue from carbon offset sales is very high for those private developers. And I think the reason with the NGO community that a lot of the money flows to communities and improving livelihoods around there and improving the health of that system we're protecting is because we also bring philanthropy that covers a lot of our costs that a private actor can't do. And so that's one of the benefits of the type of quality projects that I think we bring to the table is we're bringing philanthropy that makes it work.
And it's important to have obviously principles and ethics and be transparent about it, right? I think if you go to any of our sort of websites, probably you'll see a code of ethics, and you'll understand very transparently how these projects are developed or how the money flows. But it's an evolution. There's standards. The standards are going to change. There's going to be a push for more and more transparency, which is good. And I think as a sector as a whole, one thing that we don't have going in our favor is that we're sort of too small to fail, right? There's going to be bad actors, and there's going to be failures, and everybody will point to that one failure as somehow that's the sector as a whole, right?
Yes.
So we have to change that mentality, and obviously we want to minimize the amount of failure, but understand these are human endeavors, so we're going to have failures, right? And we have to be okay with that as long as we see continuing progress.
So for each of you, if you had a magic wand to sort of address one thing in order to bring nature-based solutions to scale, like what would that one thing be?
I can start. I mean, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, is I think bringing certainty, and it's likely through a regulatory market, to the standards, particularly around carbon, so that there's consistency out there in terms of quality, how to develop a project, and how to quantify. Because it's just, wherever you go, it's different, from government to government, from standard to standard. And I think that would be the biggest thing, is to bring that up to a quality and a consistency that we could act.
Yeah. And I would just, in specifically, quality in setting off that, quality and evaluation of what some product is or what some landscape is. A metric, a really solid metric that incorporates carbon, biodiversity, climate regulation, globally consistent, so I can compare and contrast regions and know, so the buyer could know what they're buying, the producer could know what they're likely going to achieve, those kinds of things. So I would like to see technically that.
And if we have magic wands, so I want two issues, right? One is a global carbon tax. So, if we understand what a project is, then we need that demand certainty. So that's it's not coming anytime soon, like newsflash, but that would be a goal of mine. And the other is for people to travel to these places, right? Sometimes they're very far away, they're and kind of esoteric, but anybody I've met that's actually traveled, that's seen the rainforest or the grasslands of, wherever, or Idaho, this place is amazing, right? So you fall in love with it and you understand how important these places are.
So we just have 1 minute left. Just to close, I guess I'd ask, what gives you hope in this space?
Want to start?
I have lots of hope. I didn't have much hope like 10 years ago, but now people have really woken up to everything we've been talking about nature. And what gives me hope is that there's younger people, right? It's not just us doing this. It's a whole new generation coming up that with new energy, with new ideas, and that gives me tons of hope.
Absolutely. Going to the COP meetings for 15 years, the last few have been absolutely wonderful because of the participation of young people that want to make a difference.
Yeah, and I think definitely young people. The thing I would add to that is we've talked a lot about finance and policy and regulations, and what's given me hope now is a reconnection to the spirituality and magic of nature that I start to see rekindled in people. And the more that we can connect to that place that just gives us energy and drives us forward, people are going to care more about this work that we're doing and about the future of the planet.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.